So Lauren, I don't know if you can share your screen now. So here she is. So we'll be hearing from Lauren Ricci, who will be talking about foray behavior in bighorn sheep. So Lauren, please, you can introduce yourself a bit more if you want, and otherwise just go ahead with your talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So I'm a grad student at Utah State University working with Kezia Manlove. And today I will be talking about foray behavior in bighorns. So forays are these long distance exploratory movements, and they are a driving force of MOV spread across the landscape, because if a bighorn leaves their core herd home range, they open up opportunities both for spillover from domestic sheep or transmission between bighorn herds, where either an uninfected bighorn could encounter an infected herd, or an infected bighorn could encounter a naive herd. So understanding the mechanisms driving these movements could provide direction for MOV management. If we could potentially reduce the probability of forays occurring, if we're able to alter the presence of identified drivers. So here I'll be presenting some of our current work using hidden Markov models and GPS telemetry data to characterize these forays, both identifying who's foraying and then where, when, and why they're foraying. So in the real world, an animal is constantly exhibiting and moving between behavioral states. But with GPS data, we don't explicitly collect any information on the individual's behavior state. We just get a snapshot of their location at the time of the GPS fix. But we can take those known locations and create a movement trajectory linking these GPS points over time. And if fixes are collected at a constant rate, we can describe the animal's movement trajectory both by step length, which is the Euclidean distance traveled between fixes, and turning angle, which is the change in bearing relative to their previous point. So the goal of hidden Markov models are to first try to identify the true behavioral state based on that movement trajectory, where you assign fixes to a behavioral state based on their step lengths and turning angles. And then second, trying to understand what is driving these transitions between states. So identifying covariant patterns at these points of transition. So we are using a 4-state model of bighorn sheep movement, where we've got the stationary state, where we've got very localized movement of short step lengths and large turning angles. So they are moving back and forth more than they're moving in a straight direction. And then we enter normal foraging and distance foraging states with increasing step lengths and decreasing turn angles. And then finally, we have this foray state, which is what we're interested in, which are very directed movements with long step lengths and very small turning angles. And also, because bighorn habitat use is so closely tied to escape terrain, we were able to use a third data stream in assigning these fixes. So high values of ruggedness are associated with escape terrain. So we hypothesized that stationary, normal foraging, and distance foraging states are more likely to occur at higher ruggedness values compared to our foray state. And I should note that for these foray states, we are interested in any movement with these characteristics, not just the ones that are leaving home ranges. So to give a quick example of how these models work, if we take this GPS trajectory that we have from this RAM, we can group these fixes into states where on the left you've got these foraging points, and then they transition into foraying, and then back into transitioning. And if we identify the covariate values at those transition points, we can see that the probability of transitioning from the foraging state to the foraying state, which is on the y-axis here, is higher at lower elevation values, whereas the probability of transitioning from that foraying state back into your foraging state increases as elevation increases. So jumping back to our 4-state model, we worked with Nevada's Department of Wildlife, and they gave us access to all of their bighorn sheep GPS data from across the state. So we have collars on rams and ewes in Rocky, California, and desert herds. And we used all of these data to identify these 4 states and assign points based on their step length, turning angle, and ruggedness value. And then looked at individual herd and environmental drivers of those transitions. So based on just the large extent of the data set, as well as known differences in behavior and phenology between subspecies and sexes, we ran these models separately for each subspecies sex combo. So we've got a model, for example, for desert rams and California ewes. And so we also looked at the effective age on the probability of transitioning into the foraying state, as well as herd size that we measured by the number of ewes in the population and the ram to ewe ratio. We also looked at the effect of drought on these transitions, and we chose these variables specifically because they are ones that management can manipulate. So you can change the age structure or herd demographics with hunting regulations and translocations. You can change drought, at least to some extent, by managing water guzzlers in the herd. So here are the results of the state identifications for desert rams. On the x-axis, we have the mean turning angle. So the higher the angle, the more circuitous the movement. The lower the angle, the straighter the movement. And then we've got mean step length on the y-axis. And each of these points are colored by the identified state, and the point size is scaled by the proportion of the individual's points that were assigned to that state. So the larger the point, the more frequently they were in that state. And you can see that these patterns fit pretty closely to our hypothesized states, where we've got our stationary normal foraging and distance foraging states with higher turn angles and increasing step lengths. And then we've got our foray state, where you've got these very small turn angles and large step lengths. And we found the same pattern across all of our models, where we've got these foray points that have lower turning angles, longer step lengths, and are less common. Forays on average account for about 10% of all the GPS fixes that we have. So we next looked at patterns in the distance and duration of forays. And we found, surprisingly, similar patterns between ewes and rams. So even though these forays are normally attributed to rams, we found that ewes are on average foraying equal distances and for equal durations. Where we did find a difference is in the location of these forays. So on the left, we've got some examples of trajectories color-coded by state. So the pink is the foray state. And you can see that for some of these trajectories, they're clearly leaving their home ranges that are the shaded areas behind them. But for other forays, they are staying completely within the bounds of that home range. So we found that overall, it was fairly uncommon for these forays to leave home ranges, but it was more common for rams to leave than for ewes. All right, and moving on from here, everything else I'll be talking about is these drivers of transitions between forays and all of the home ranging states combined. And we are looking at specifically the desert and California rams. We dropped the Rocky rams just due to a smaller sample size of demographic data. And we're also looking at rut in periods outside of rut separately, because both ram behavior during rut is different from their behavior throughout the rest of the year. And you can see from this plot that forays are more frequent during rut, where we've got this peak on that red line around October to December, which lines up with the period of rut for California rams. So I first want to go through and kind of explain how I will be presenting this data. And we're going to use the effective age on desert rams as an example here. So on the left, these are like the plots that I showed you earlier, where you can see the probability of beginning a foray between the ages of 2 and 10. And you can see that as age increases, the probability of making that transition decreases and has an even larger effect during rut. Another way of looking at this data is using the multiplicative change in odds. So, for example, if the multiplicative change in odds is 1, that means that as you increase your age by some unit of change, so here we're looking at a 6-month change, that 6 months doesn't have any effect on the probability of initiating a foray. Because if you take the current probability or odds of beginning your foray, multiply it by 1, you're still at the same probability. If your odds are greater than 1, you are more likely to go on a foray, and if they're less than 1, you're less likely to start that foray. And we can see that that is where these desert rams land for age, where as you increase by 6 months of age, rams are less likely to initiate a foray. And another way of kind of interpreting these results is to think of it as if your change in odds is greater than 1, that individual is going on more forays compared to if your change in odds is less than 1, you're going to be going on fewer forays. So then if we look at the transition from foraying back into home ranging states, you can see that both during and outside of rut, as rams are increasing in age, the probability of transitioning back into their home ranging behavior increases. And you can see that same pattern on the right, where their change in odds is above 1. And while you can use the change in odds of the beginning of the foray to look at the frequency of forays. You can use the change in odds for the ending of forays to look at the duration of forays. So if your change in odds is less than 1, your forays are going to be longer because the probability of you ending that foray is lower compared to if your change in odds is above 1, your forays are going to be shorter. So here are those desert ram results for age, where as age increases, forays become less frequent and shorter. We found that as we increase the number of ewes, forays are also becoming less frequent, but the length of the forays is decreasing. When we increase the ram to ewe ratio, so there'd be fewer ewes for every ram, forays became less frequent outside of rut. The interaction crosses that line at 1 during rut, so we can't say that we see any interaction there. And then outside of rut, forays are becoming longer as that ratio increases, but again, we see no interaction during rut. And finally, we found that as we increase drought prevalence, forays become less frequent, but when rams are on foray, they are foraying for much longer distances. And while I discuss the California ram results, I'm going to keep these desert results here grayed out just for the sake of comparison. So we found the opposite effect of age here, where as California ram age increases, they're actually more likely to go on foray, but we see the same pattern where older rams are going on shorter forays. We also found that outside of rut, forays become less frequent and longer as the number of ewes increases, and that outside of rut, increasing the ram to ewe ratio decreases the probability of going on foray, and we weren't able to see any effect of that ram to ewe ratio on the length of forays, both for inside and outside of your rut period. And finally, when we looked at drought, we found that there is no effect of drought on the frequency of forays outside of rut, but during rut, you've got this really big effect where as drought increases, you're less likely to go on foray. And also as drought increases, surprisingly, outside of rut, your forays are going to be shorter compared to during rut, where your forays are going to be longer. So just in conclusion, what we found is that we could detect forays in all of the 3 subspecies, so deserts, Californias, and rocky rams and ewes. And the distance and duration of forays in these sexes and subspecies was actually very similar. The majority of the forays we identified remain within these core herd home ranges, but rams are more likely to foray outside of those home ranges. And finally, the prevalence of forays is temporally variable, and forays are more common during rut for desert and California rams. If we're looking for conclusions on the effect of these variables on foray transitions, we found that for desert rams, you're likely to find more forays when your rams are younger, and when you've got lower U counts in ram to U ratios, and your forays are going to be longer when you've got, again, younger rams and low U counts, but you have higher ram to U ratios. In California rams, we found that you'll see more forays with older rams, higher U counts, and lower ram to U ratios, and your forays are going to be longer with younger rams, lower U counts, and we couldn't find any interaction of the ram to U ratio with the length of forays. So what this shows us is that age explains a lot of the foray dynamics that we're seeing. And demography does still have some explanatory power, but for the most part, what we see is in the deserts, more young rams are foraying. In California, more older rams are foraying. But between both the deserts and Californias, the rams that are making these long distance forays are more likely to be younger. And if we look at drought, we found that during a drought, you are more likely to go on foray when there's less drought for both rut and outside of rut. You're more likely to find longer forays when you have more drought. And then in California rams, you'll have more forays with less drought, and during rut, you'll have longer forays when there's more drought, but longer forays when there's less drought outside of rut. So these results from both the demographics and the drought here are very preliminary. We're still digging into them and plan on examining them much more closely. But we can see that drought does have an effect on the frequency and duration of forays. And the direction we're moving in next, and I'm working with a grad student in our lab to look at this, is how guzzlers interact with drought to drive these movement behaviors. So if anyone out there has any thoughts on how to examine these interactions, we would love to hear your ideas. And with that, I would like to thank the Nevada Department of Wildlife, especially Mike Cox, for letting me have this awesome data set, and my lab mates at Utah State University. And with that, I would take any questions.
Thank you, Lauren. So we probably have time for a question before heading for the break. Okay, so here's a long one. So Kevin, I don't know if you want to raise your hand, or, but otherwise I'll try to read it. So Kevin Bletcha is asking, it seems that the forays within the core herd range are interesting, but it really isn't a management concern. While they are defined as forays in terms of how the Markov movement model is concerned, it doesn't really fit the classic definition of forays, according to Singer et al. Thus, it seems like these within herd movements should almost be called something else. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so we've thought about that quite a bit. I would argue that when it comes to a management standpoint, these long distance forays, even within a home range, can have an effect on disease transmission if they're connecting subpopulations within a herd. And also, just on a more technical note, when it comes to the data, these foray behaviors are already only 10% of our GPS set. And then when only 10 to 20% of these forays, points identified as being on foray, leave the home range, it really decreases our power to see any effect.
Maybe a last quick one, and then there's another one that I will post and you can answer later on, maybe. So Marco is just asking if you've seen any permanent dispersal, or is it just rams that come back to their original herd?
I haven't looked at that explicitly. The large forays that stand out on a map are all big looping trajectories, and while they might cross over different herds, they do generally go back to their own. But that's very interesting. I'll have to look into that.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. So I will put the last question in the Q&A and you can answer that, typing the answer, I think. So I just want to conclude this session by thanking the 4 speakers for their very interesting research. So now we have a 20-minute break. So please come back at 2:20 sharp. It will be the management session with Mark Boyce. So thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll see you in about 20 minutes.